Bam.
Hi, this is Tim Grover, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, it's almost baseball season. This time next week, there'll already be pitchers and catchers in camp. Do you get excited for spring training?
Yeah, it means that warmer weather is coming, and the old hope springs eternal for everybody who's a baseball fan. Hoping my Minnesota Twins know what they're doing up there. I have my doubts. A lot of people do. They didn't do anything last year or before last season to kind of really add on to the roster and strengthen things. And they folded hard that end of the last season. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
I don't know either. I don't know either. Yeah, it's so everybody knows I love baseball. Tim has written a great book about baseball, and it's about the barnstorming era. So when you live in your part of the country, there's a lot of Cardinals fans, there's a lot of Cubs fans, and a lot of Twins fans. How did you get to the Twins?
I probably was about 10 years old. My grandpa Rainey and my uncle Butch, they were into the Twins. I didn't really get to see them that often, but you'd go up there, they'd listen to the Twins games. WHO radio carried the Twins out of Des Moines, and they were a clear channel station. We could pick them up really well up in Northeast Iowa, where I grew up. And so we'd fall asleep listening to Herb Carneal and Halsey Hall and Merle Harmon talking about Killebrew hitting his monster home runs and Carew stealing bases and stuff. So that was fun, exciting time. My brother was a Cardinals fan, and I like the Cardinals too, and the Cubs. Those were the three big teams in the Midwest back then. The Royals didn't come around till 1969, and Kansas City seemed like it was a long ways away from Northeast Iowa. And then Brewers came in 1970, and nobody that I know liked the White Sox. So I don't know what the deal was there. But loved the Twins. I think that connection with my with my grandpa and great uncle and my uncle. And like the Cubs, too, there were three really exciting teams to follow here in the Midwest, late 60s, early 70s.
It's crazy the impact that radio had on, and I'm saying your region of the Midwest, this enormous hunk of the country that really have a connection to a major city. Yes, St. Louis, yes, Chicago. I'm not saying that it's all small towns out there, but Tulsa's nowhere near where you are. It just gets spread out, right? And you think about the connection to the rest of the big world, especially if you're on a farm somewhere, and there's a lot of farm country out there. Yeah, maybe the White Sox should have bought a bigger broadcaster machine or something.
I don't know. That's one reason that St. Louis was so popular, too, in the Midwest. KMOX, they had I think they had a clear channel station like WHO did, so people all over the Midwest were able to hear the Cardinals games, and that drew them a lot of fans and a big following.
Yeah. And they were reliably good for a long time over, the middle third of that century. Boy, if you liked the Cardinals, you had a pretty good shot at having several good years during your youth.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Team Dizzy Dean, the Gas House Gang, Leo DeRocher on that team, and then Stan Musial. I can't remember if he was in on that or a little bit later than that, but yeah. And then, all the way through the 60s. Have you read that book by David Halberstam called The Summer? Oh, it's up there on my shelf someplace. Anyway, it talks about what's hidden behind the cup up there. Anyway, about the 1964 season and how it came down between the Cardinals and the Yankees, and the Yankees were kind of more old-time traditional, big white guys, power ball, hit it 600 feet, and the Cardinals were bringing that National League young black players, kind of small ball thing to the forefront. And so it's a really great book about how baseball culture kind of changed and how that World Series was sort of a microcosm of what was going on in our country and in baseball, and kind of how the game changed, because American League was so late to bringing black players onto their teams. I mean, the Red Sox talk about the curse of the Bambino, but I think I've read that the Red Sox had tryouts for Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and didn't sign them because they were black. And
Right.
imagine those guys and Ted Williams in the outfield. And the Red Sox, they were the last team to integrate in 1959, a guy named Pumpsie Green. They could have had Willie Mays or Hank Aaron, but they got Pumpsie, you know?
Yeah. There's a lot of who wrote the book? It's something about and I read it this year, and I read so many books, it's hard to keep them all straight in my head, but there was a book about like the loss of our innocence. It's a Dodger book, and they talk about maybe it's Ditmore, because Ditmore wrote a book about Jim Gilliam, right? And so this is a great conversation. So Jim Gilliam is this player largely forgotten. He dies suddenly on the eve of the Dodgers going to the World Series. He's a coach, but he was in the Negro Leagues and just came from nothing. It's like, hey, I'll play baseball pretty good. Kept playing. Next thing you know, he's a kid, but he's in the Negro Major Leagues and playing with all these guys. And they were just in that right slice of time where they might get called out for being too old. They might get called out for, look, they're just going to have a hard time integrating. Let's just be honest about this. There's a black and white side of this. And if you had enough animosity, or you just weren't used to white people, you know, and you were going to have trouble, you didn't get on the first bus to go integrate because everybody was trying to manage this delicate thing and run a business at the same time. These things were all hard. And so part of this book was talking about the evolution. There's several, like we think about Jackie Robinson, everything's fixed. Like, no, Jackie Robinson. And then, hey, let's not get too many black players on the field. Hey, hold on, that coach, you know, that's too much, you know. And so you keep having to break through these things. And Jim Gilliam hit each one of these barriers. And there's actually, if you look at his baseball reference page, you know, they've done a wonderful job. Like, hey, we're going to integrate the Negro League numbers, and we'll continue to get better about that. But there is the big integration time, and then they're like, anybody's in the Negro Leagues at this time, we're not even going to acknowledge it. It's not a minor league team. It's not a major league team. It's just blank space, as if he went off to war or something, you know? And so we did see this change in how baseball was played, these exciting players. And by the way, a lot of this comes from barnstorming. You know, the Savannah Bananas are like the progeny of the grand progeny of this era, where you have this exciting brand of baseball. It's like, hey, we're here to sell tickets. Yes, we're going to play baseball, but can you, like, let's do something exciting. And so the stodgy, older style lost to this new, flashy, fantastic style that everybody loved. And it's, again, powered by radio, powered by people getting in buses and going through small towns. But you go to a small town, you show up. If you show up in some small town in Iowa, you're like, hey, we're here in Van Meter to play baseball, everybody's going to come out.
Yeah, that was really what drew me into researching and writing my book. Is I found out that, well, yeah, I mean, I've known about Babe Ruth forever, but you think Babe Ruth, New York, and yeah, obviously playing American League cities, but found out they played in Iowa 4 different times. And the first time was in October 1922, after the World Series, and the Yankees had lost for the second time to the New York Giants. Babe batted like 118. And he had been suspended for the first 6 weeks of the 1922 season, because he had gone out and done some barnstorming, which had been prohibited under a dumb rule that Major League Baseball had set up in 1914, and Kenesaw, and they hadn't really pushed that through, you know, really enforced it that much. But good old Kenesaw Landis came in after the Black Sox scandal, and he was hardcore on everything. And he told Babe and Bob Meusel after the 1921 season, after they'd had some barnstorming gigs lined up, he said, no, you can't do that. It's against the rules. And Babe pretty much said, I'm Babe effing Ruth. I'm going to do what I want to do. And so you got 2 huge egos clashing, and Landis won that one. The boys lost their $5,200 in World Series bonus money and got suspended for the first 6 weeks of the season. And Babe did some other crazy things that year. And got suspended for a few more games. Apparently, you're not supposed to throw dirt at the umpire, even if you're Babe Ruth.
Called out the entire stadium. You all right? Not that son of a bitch? Which son of a bitch? All of you getting the laugh. Can you imagine if that happened today? If if I don't know, Mookie Betts gets on top of the dugout, and it's like any motherfucker in this place. Come on, let's go.
Well, he did go chasing in the grandstands for somebody who was heckling him, which I thought was pretty funny. And they were booing him in New York when he first came back because he didn't have a great start. And so that led to some crazy stuff. But again, after the 22 series, Landis had cut him some slack so they could go ahead and barnstorm. And it came out after the series. He said, yeah, you can do that. But I'm guessing they had some kind of a gentleman's agreement before then, because Landis had met privately with Ruth in Boston during the season. And after that, I think Landis was telling him to settle down, but also, hey, babe, I'm not a total prick. You guys can barnstorm after this if you do okay. And they did. Plus, they had a bunch of barnstorming gigs already lined up, so it wasn't like they scrambled, the first of October to line some of these things up. So
let me jump in here, because when you have the person who runs the entire business, Babe Ruth in this case, yes, Kenesaw Mountain Landis is in charge of things. He's, the commissioner. But if George doesn't want to do something, he's not going to do it. And what people we've lost, because he's been dead for almost 100 years now. But if you read the newspapers of the time, he is on every page of every newspaper. If they can put his name in, it's like Donald Trump. If you could put his name on the news in something, people are going to comment about it. They're going to read it. They're going to buy things, And so Ruth was not only a baseball money-making machine. He was like, you put him on the society page, people are going to read the society page. And I know you've been through these archives, but it is amazing, the illustrations. And you're like, how did he got the, this major event, whatever it is, like Lindbergh's baby getting stolen. And don't forget Babe Ruth right next to it. It is crazy how pervasive he was in the zeitgeist.
Well, and some of the ads that would show up in the local newspapers too, we're the Babe Ruth of hardware stores, like
all the time.
Don't get the connection, but it's hilarious. And I think Babe helped bring the whole modern sports celebrity thing. A lot of that kicked off with him. He would go out and, he made a lot of money, but he spent it quicker than he made it, I think. There was a crazy story about how he lost like $50,000 or $100,000 in Cuba when he was down there barnstorming and got really drunk. They locked him in something, took all of his money. But yeah, he was ready to go pimping for anybody that would throw a few dollars his way. So he, I think he just smoked cigars, but I've got a old metal tin, Babe Ruth says chew Redman tobacco or whatever, Chesterfield cigarettes or anything like that. He would, he was there. He was there for the money. And
can you imagine Shohei Ohtani saying, "Smoke these cigarettes today"? Oh my
wow! I know.
Yeah, it's such a different time now.
It is. It really is. Yeah. But no more than what he was getting paid at the time either. You think the Red Sox, he'd taken them to a couple of World Series in 1919, and granted, he had a contract signed for $10,000 a year, but he went back to Harry Frazee and said, "Hey, I had a hell of a year here, and I want $20,000." And Harry's like, "No. And by the way, I got this Broadway production thing that I need money for, and I'm calling up the Yankees." Yankees were happy to buy him from Harry for I think $125,000, and they were more than happy to pay Babe $20,000 a year. And then, he hit, I think that was the year he hit 54 home runs. He did 29 the year before for Boston, and then 54, I think, his first year in New York, or maybe it was second year. But anyway, the Yankees, that investment paid off very well for them. And the Red Sox had been, I think they've been to the first 5 World Series that had been played. And after they lost Ruth, they weren't back until the Kurt Schilling thing, when I can't remember what year that was anymore, 96 or whatever, a long, long, long time. And so it was, crazy baseball mythology and the way that all that stuff kind of works out,
Let's talk a little bit about Bob Meusel. And by the way, his brother, Irish Muesel, another, these are good players. They disappear a little bit because, they're not the elite of the greats, and you're on a team with so many Hall of Famers. It's hard to stand out. But Bob, so here's the thing that folks may not realize was you could run a baseball life and have an excellent career and never be in the major leagues. If you wanted to play in the Pacific Coast League, you make a fantastic living out there because it was really Major League Baseball. It's just, you didn't have to travel from New York to Boston to wherever. You just traveled from Seattle to Yakima to, whatever. So it was a different thing. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, it was all train travel by then, too. They weren't flying across the country like they are now. So that's why if you look at the original 16 teams in baseball, well, a lot of them were in the same cities. But other than that, it was, just a few hours to travel, hop on the train and go, So, but
So a guy like Muesel, there's a lot of dudes like that who never even make the major leagues, not because they weren't good enough, but just they didn't want to make that sacrifice or they didn't get along with that system. They're like, what am I doing here? By the way, I can go barnstorm whenever I want. I can go get a regular job in a couple of years when I can't play anymore over at the mill and still really just play baseball. And so even semi-pro, there were guys making a decent living, building ships and playing baseball, and primarily playing baseball. So a guy like Bob, I don't want to say he's barely in the major leagues, but if he can go out and barnstorm, he's gonna, with that Yankee title behind him, boy, oh boy, he's gonna make a lot of money.
Well, there's an argument that Muesel could have made the Hall of Fame. I think he had like a 310 career average, but he was kind of a dick, He wasn't always hustling on the base paths, and ball players watched that, and they, he wasn't the coolest guy to hang with. He had a hell of an arm. I've read that he still is rated as like one of the best right field arms in baseball history. And when he wanted to play, he could really play. But he was also a drinking buddy of Ruth and a whore chaser with Ruth, and I think that's why they got along so well, and that's why they went barnstorming together. And and back to your point too about guys that could have maybe played Major League Baseball. There were only half as many teams back then as there are now. You wouldn't get, there were a lot of different minor leagues out there. And, you could have signed on for one of them, but the money was not that great. If you got a guy who's farming and young family and kids, they can't take that break away during planting to harvest season to go play baseball with a chance that maybe they'll make it, but probably not. And so what was fascinating for me too is when Babe goes out and plays these towns, like Pratt, Kansas, and they face some really good small town pitching. Just because a guy was a high school teacher or whatever didn't mean he couldn't throw a bullet,
Right.
And so that was really cool for me to see that sometimes these guys would come in and, granted, they probably weren't always trying their hardest. They've been traveling a lot, bumpy steam trains. One stretch, they went from Sioux City out to Deadwood, South Dakota, and down to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, over to Tarkio, Missouri. That's 1,200 miles in 3 days. And you can imagine they were probably, not just physically tired, but mentally tired. Every place they show up, hey, babe, da-da-da, not good to meet you, buddy. Come over here, And I mean, the whole Chamber of Commerce people, visiting the hospitals, orphanages, that was not a burden to Babe. He loved doing that stuff. But, they probably weren't trying real hard at some of these places, especially if only 500 people show up. But there were some great small town pitchers back then too.
There's also something to be said if you're Babe Ruth and you show up and Tim Grover's pitching, like, I'm just going to give this kid a little something, I'll swing hard. And if he K's me, that's all right, because it's show business. Right. And Babe knew that. And I'm sure Bob did too, and when they need to, they turn it on, but do they need to? Like, we're here to entertain people. Right. Not getting paid to win.
Well, and it seemed like a lot of times Babe would show up, and during batting practice, he would hit the ball, 450 feet, 3 or 4 pitches in a row, and then it would come time to play ball, and he'd be lucky to get a couple of singles. And so,
yeah,
but it goes that way sometimes,
It does. It does. And the other thing is if you've ever been around anybody who's super famous, like Babe Ruth famous, and you see day to day what they have to do, they can't say no to anybody. And so really it is, even if you don't mind like the orphanage kids, you start to wear out when it gets to the Chamber of Commerce and, Mr. Big Bucks over here, Mr. So-and-so, and you're just like, yeah, God, all right, thanks. Yeah. And like there isn't a lot of rest, right? And unless you have someone that will pull you away, a handler, like Babe's got to go, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to watch the person do that stuff. And I've been involved in that where you're trying to help someone who's very, very, very famous. And I'm like, oh my God, someone has to say no for you. Let me go help you and say, like, hey, that's it. We got to go, and it's like, oh, nothing I can do. I got to go. See you later,
Right. And he had a guy named Christy Walsh too, who was kind of his agent, I guess, who was lining up a lot of these commercial deals for him. And, Babe was like a ghostwriter for syndicated newspaper columns, things like that. But I think Christy was also the guy that if, Babe got caught with the mayor's wife last night, Christy would go in and kind of sweep that stuff under the rug. And, the sports writers at the time, they went along with that for the most part. They weren't going to piss off Babe Ruth because he was always great for a quote or, well, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to piss off Babe. I'd want to be hanging with him and stay in his orbit, Yeah. So definitely different times, When
you think about these guys coming off the Yankees losing in 22, Waite Hoyt has a terrible. Have you read Waite Hoyt's biography that came out?
I haven't.
Oh,
no,
man,
he was he was roommate with Babe, wasn't he? But he said he was he was a roommate with Babe's suitcase, I think.
Yeah.
I want to read that.
It's so good. He talks about it, and it's really interesting. So the guy who wrote the book, also Tim Manners, he ended up knowing Waite's son, and Waite's son is now, he's old himself and everything, but he's like, my dad is a famous Yankee Murderers Row Yankee Hall of Famer, and he's like, which guy's your dad? And he had no idea. He's like, it was Waite Hoyt.
Right.
He's like, who's Waite Hoyt? And it just so happens that a couple of things linked together, and there was this archive of attempts at writing an auto, and how prolific he was with words and everything. So he had these autobiographies that weren't quite ever done, and he was able to put it together and just capture this wonderful. So you have this guy who's loquacious, absolutely an entertainer of the first order, but also a very good pitcher. And so that anybody I'll put a link for the episode. It's so good, and that book is so great. But we're here to talk about Tim's book. Yes. It's on my computer. I can't hold it up for you. Hold it up.
Where is it? Right here?
There it is. This thing smokes, man. I love this book. It's so good. You did a wonderful job. Was it newspapers that were your primary source, or did you find any? Because there's so many secondary and tertiary things that don't matter, but they're so rich in context. You just have to use them.
Yeah. And one book that I found later in my whole, I think after I'd written a draft or two already, was Jane Levy's book called The Big Fella. And she her background there is like the 1927 exhibition tour that Babe and Bob did. I'm wearing my Bustin' Babes shirt right here.
Yeah.
So Babe's team would be the Bustin' Babes, and Lou Gehrig's was the Larapin Lou's. But so she talks about that tour, but then also brings in all of these things about Babe's life. And so it's kind of an overarching biography about Babe Ruth. That's where I found some of the stuff about his early years and things like that. But my a lot of my primary sources were from newspapers.com, because where else are you going to find things about Pratt, Kansas, or Drumright, Oklahoma, or Perry, Iowa, for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's where I spend a lot of my time. And again, like you go in and you see some kind of fancy day, especially from like a very unknown place. The other day I did a search. I used StatHead. The plug for those guys is great. And I'm like, okay, who are guys who played third base just one time in their career or had no hits or anything? And I found the guy that had the best day of all the people that have, basically one shot one day at first base. And this one guy, he had a home run, hit a triple, and that was really like the high point of his entire career. He plays 1 year. But so you take that day and you laser in and you're like, what was going on in the world that day? Who else was doing amazing things? Oh, this is a couple days after this major prize fight. Oh, and then like you put it all together and there's just a compelling, every day there's a compelling story, and it all can focus around this guy that no one's ever going to think about again in baseball because he has an 80-game career. But on that one day, he was part of this whole news cycle. And it's amazing what you can find.
That is cool. Yeah. And that's what's fun for me too, is digging up some of these obscure things, finding out that one of the guys that he played against, I think in Oklahoma or Kansas, wound up going to the majors and was one of the very first guys to have an unassisted triple play. Okay. Oh, yeah. Or there was an Indian guy in Oklahoma that supposedly it said in what I found was he was the first full-blooded Native American to play Major League Baseball. But I think since then, the guy who became the mascot of the Cleveland Indians, he probably was. But, just coming across sort of random things like that, really, that's what makes history fun, I think,
Yeah. And you can, I'm talking about, the formula of find an interesting game from any player and then look at the news and you're like, oh, here's this picture of Sugar Ray Robinson, and he's going to fight. And all these great illustrations because the illustrators really, you've seen these guys. It's just like, oh my gosh, what an amazing, you don't need Canva. You need that dude because he's so great. He's so original and he's hand drawing it. And it's incredible. And I love these things. I'm going to post one of them right now. Just a quick picture, but these things are, they're really they're treasures, and they're right there. And you've got to want to look through these old newspapers, but I just can't stop looking at them. That's what happens to me.
Well, yeah, all the old ads and things like that, for coal, get your coal delivered,
right.
Winter's coming, or just all that sort of stuff. Insane. And for that period of time too that I was writing about, the early 20s, in 1920 there were only 30 radio stations on the air. So any news that you were getting obviously wasn't coming on ESPN. It was from your newspaper. Right. That's when newspapers really ruled as far as the media and stuff goes, But it wasn't till 1922 or 23 KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first radio broadcast for baseball games. So
here, I'm going to put this picture up here, this image. This is just a thing. It's from 1922, but it also it works. It looks like something you might see someone write about a bunch of bowlers, and so you have this funny little cartoon. It's no big deal. But stuff like that, we don't have anything like that anymore. And I miss these things. And so when you have a chance to go through these archives, there's just some really wonderful little treasures to enjoy. And so when you and I are doing this, we get to go look at this great story written by whoever, this sports writer who is so obsolete now. There's not even an entry in Wikipedia for them. This is like they're just gone. Whoever Keats Malone, whoever that was, right? And it's like gone forever. But they write this beautiful piece, or even just someone from 25 years ago who was writing for the Boca Raton Herald or whatever, and their column from that day links into something. I love giving that person, because it's a chance they'll be on X or something, and that they'll see that someone read something that they wrote 25 years ago. Who wouldn't want that to show up on their doorstep?
Oh, right. Yeah. That's very cool. And I think it's funny too how some of the small town newspapers, the editors just kind of seem like they wanted to, maybe on an ego trip, well, Babe Ruth came to town and we were not that impressed with him. When in one of the Oklahoma newspapers called him Boob Ruth, or Said that Muesel was in mud up to his ankles, because he played first base instead of outfield and missed a few fielding chances, or just, dumb, funny stuff like that. And I think some of the small town people too were a little, expected Babe to come up and bat 4 or 5 times and hit 12 home runs. Well, that wasn't going to happen. For various reasons that we talked about earlier. But then, they kind of start booing him, or even before he came to town, some were kind of arrogant. Well, he's not nearly as good as our small town guys. And some of the small town guys would go out there and wind up showing him up for, again, maybe they were great players. Maybe Ruth was hungover. Maybe Muesel didn't give a shit that day. Maybe they saw there was only a few hundred people in the stands, and they were supposedly guaranteed the first $2,000 of the gate. And there were a lot of times that they just took whatever money was made that day. And I don't think by the end of it, they really came out ahead at all. Maybe broke even. I don't know. And some of the games where they played, where they could have drawn well, like it was rainy in Kansas City when they were there. It was a blizzard. It was snowing in Denver. Why you'd want to play Denver baseball October 28th, I don't know, but money.
Yeah.
So they ran into a few obstacles there too.
Yeah. I'm looking at an edition of the Eastern Transcript. That is a paper that covers Leavenworth, Kansas, October 20th, 1922, and it's Babe Ruth at Leavenworth next Monday, right? And this thing is primarily ads. It's not a newspaper that has a lot of the news hole is small.
Okay.
And so the front page is like ads all up and down it, and there's a little strip of news. But there's all kinds of great stuff in there, Turkish peace accords, and this royal from Serbia is like, get out of here. And so they boot him out, exiled, and that kind of thing. All kinds of neat stuff. Oh, and by the way, here comes Babe Ruth. And someone coming to Leavenworth in 1922, that just couldn't happen all the time. You got to want to get to Leavenworth, Kansas. It's not far from Kansas City in the modern day. But back then, in 1920, unless you had some kind of car, you weren't going to get out there.
Well, and the deal with that game, too, which was kind of funny, is they had been offered, I think, a ride out there in a car, but it rained a lot in Kansas City that day before. It must have been overnight as well. And I think the car got stuck in the mud. And so
I was about to say the roads couldn't be good. Yeah.
No. And I write in my book, too, that at the time, if you had a Model T to drive any place, first of all, the roads were crappy. It wasn't until 1930s that the Lincoln Highway was built, I think that was the first transcontinental 2-lane highway. But your Model T had like a 20 horsepower engine, and the tires on it were as wide as those fat bike tires are now.
Yeah.
So imagine, go drive out in the country to your favorite level B road and try driving down, you're not going to get very far, especially if it's been raining. So they had to wait to catch it was like a trolley or interurban railroad thing that went out to Leavenworth from KC, and they had to wait like 2 hours for the next one for that. So they showed up late for their game in Leavenworth that day.
Yeah. The headline from the Leavenworth Tribune, Bob Ruth and Bob Muesel arrived for an exhibition game. Then sub-headline, large crowd of baseball fans greet big leaguers at the Soldiers' Home, arrived 3 hours late. Thanks for showing up. You got a little late. Don't be late.
Right. Yeah. And what's crazy, too, is some of the small towns you would think that would have been like a huge, big news thing for them. But I had a really hard time finding anything about the Tarkio game. I had to finally found something in the St. Joe paper, I think. Because Tarkio didn't have a local paper. They didn't have a county seat paper that had anything in it. So that's what was fun about it too, I guess, was that trying to track down some of these games. Because I had that book, Bill Jenkinson, That's a hard name to say, so I'm only going to say it once. The year Babe Ruth hit 108 home runs, and he tracked every single home run that Babe hit during regular season, World Series. Remember if Babe played in All-Star games or not, but preseason, exhibition, spring training, and that's where he came up with 108 home runs. But I just forgot where I was going with that one. All the home runs he hit. Okay, never mind. Brain fart. Okay,
that's all right.
Moving along.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I mean, yeah, it's hard to find things, and I have never said the words "drum right Oklahoma" before. Go ahead. You got it back. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So from that book, because he had that's where I found out that Babe played in Iowa, and he actually hit 3 home runs in Des Moines, Iowa, in 1926, which he only did one other time in his major league career during the regular season, which was his last game when he was playing for the Boston
Indians.
The Boston Braves. The Boston Braves, he was playing for them. But so, you could trace some of those home runs in Jenkinson's book. I did say it twice. But, you could connect, let's say, Omaha to Sioux City or whatever. But then it's like, okay, where was he between here and here? He finished up in Denver, but where was he at between Kansas City and Denver? And you have to do some digging. And they're like, oh, last night he was in Pratt. Oh, okay, that's cool. The day before Fort Scott. So you just kind of keep doubling back and digging that way and finding those little gems,
It's baseball has so much lore in it, like did Babe Ruth actually do this, or did Casey Stengel say that or whatever. And so a thing that I learned, because I used to think that Babe's last game was 3 home runs. I'm like, well, wouldn't you come back the next day and to see if you could hit another one? But it wasn't his last game. He had another 9 at bats over another 4 or 5 days. Nothing though. He couldn't. That was his last hit.
Okay,
really is what it was, right? But yeah, we see these things, and what's wonderful now is we can go back and look at the record, and people have found these games, and they're like, oh, by the way, here's these next 4 games or whatever it is, and we can add an extra RBI to someone's record, and all these. It's amazing the accounting that can happen with this game, even though it's 160 years old. And if you go see the oldest stories about baseball, they spell words differently. They don't use punctuation in the way that we do. It really is reading a different dialect of English.
And the writing styles too, because Sec Taylor was a guy who was the editor of the Des Moines Register, sports editor, and the AAA stadium Iowa Cubs play at for a long time was named Sec Taylor Stadium, of course, till it got corporate. Now it's Principal Park, but I think it's still called Sec Taylor Field, so that's cool. Good. But he wrote some great stuff about the Perry game. Like Muesel hit a grand slam in the bottom of the first, and he said that Bob just trotted around the bags and was sitting on the bench by the time the Sphere had returned to civilization, and Babe got struck out on a spitball. And Taylor described that. He said the Pella pitcher coughed on the ball, quote, before delivering in such a way that it is not considered good etiquette in the best of baseball circles,
Yeah.
And then he wrote, not to be outdone, the infant, as he called Babe, tried to infringe on the rules himself by stepping up on the pitches 8 or 10 feet to catch them before they broke. So he was trying to, I can't imagine pitching to Babe Ruth, let alone 50 feet away. Then Babe hit her triple. Yeah. Taylor said Muesel could have caught it if he had been trying. And he described Ruth. I thought this was really cool. He said that he moved with unbelievable speed for a man built like a giant above the waist and just like a normal human being in the legs, So it's cool to read most observations like that you don't kind of think about or see them worded that way, I guess,
Yeah. That certainly has gone out of style for the most part in our day-to-day consumption of news, at least sports news, right? Look, you might have some of that flashy stuff on TV if you watch ESPN, but if you happen to read a breakdown of a game, it's very clinical now. Like they don't have things where they describe these things. And I guess it's because we can see it, we can hear it. But back then, if you didn't read about it, you have no idea what happened. Like one of the things I've been trying to figure out was Bill Buckner has one of the greatest arms for first base. And I can't wrap my head around it, right? And so someone has to go in and look at it. So I'm looking at it and I'm like, is this flips to the pitcher? And if so, why are there so many of those? Does that mean he has a good arm? Does that mean he has good range? And you're looking like, he kind of has good range, but that doesn't explain this gigantic number of assists. And so, like you start to go through these processes, and if they don't describe it in that breakdown of that game in 2 or 3 different pages, because often it's the same breakdown, you just don't know. You just don't know where the ball went, or like if they don't say it was a whistler to first, a hard one hopper to the pitcher or something, you just don't know. It's just, the out was recorded 1-3, and that's it. Like, okay, yeah. It's so that I'm grateful for that descriptive writing, even if sometimes it's a little hokey now.
Oh yeah,
I like it.
Yeah, yeah. That's what's fun to go back and read the. I think somebody said he hit a ball that was headed for Moose Jaw. Like, where's Moose?
I read that one. Yeah,
Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. It's like, okay, who even knows what Saskatchewan is? And I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah. And what a weird name check, because I was thinking about how far away that was, because it's in Canada, right? And so unless you happen to have some kind of reference to that, and my reference is from TV, because someone was from Moose Jaw, Canada, in some TV. Maybe it was Laverne and Shirley or something. But you wouldn't even know where Moose Jaw was. Why would you know anything? Even if you live in Iowa, or even if you live in North Dakota, would you know where Saskatchewan was?
Right.
Probably not,
Yeah, that's a totally random random reference there, I think,
Did Babe write anything when he was barnstorming? Did he have like an opted column or whatever?
Well, he had like a ghostwritten column that I think it was Christy Walsh. I don't know who he had writing that stuff for him. I think Ford Frick was he was commissioner of baseball like in the 60s. But I think he was also like a press guy for Ruth, and I think he was ghostwriting a lot of that stuff, But as far as Babe's any reports from along the way, no, I don't think, nothing that I've come across. But it was fun reading some of the things he was saying after he returned to New York about riding on the jerkwater railroads, and I wanted to have jerkwater in the title of my book, Babe Ruth and jerkwater. But my editor says, no, probably not advisable. Jerkwater to you and me means a backwater place, a hinterlands out in the boonies. But if you look up Urban Dictionary, jerkwater refers to a male fluid. So we'll leave it at that. So
yeah.
I still like this.
You use it in the book, though.
Yeah, I know. I still like to sneak in jerkwater when I can, when I'm talking to people on the radio, whatever, just because I can.
Well, and there's a lot of sexual terms that if you don't even know, again, what's Saskatchewan, what's Moose Jaw, what's jerkwater,
right?
Yeah. When you pitched this book, did you self-publish, or did you have your agent publish it for you?
Oh, what agent? You're looking at the agent.
Okay.
There's a guy named Tony Postgen, and he owns, I think he owns anyway, Book Press Publishing in Des Moines, and he was involved with West Des Moines Area Community College, and he would host this thing every year called Celebrate Innovation. And it was awesome. He was a fighter pilot, got a real strong military background, but also really into the space program. So he's friends with a lot of Apollo astronauts, people involved, really high level people. But he would do this thing called Celebrate Innovation every year and bring these people to town free to the public to go and hear these guys talk, signing autographs and stuff afterward. But he had the publishing arm of it too. And so a lot of his books are like kind of STEM related or business leadership related. And I had met him a few times from going to the Celebrate Innovation events and some book fairs that he had. And I had my manuscript kind of put together and walked up to him and said, "Hey, I wrote this. You think you might be interested?" And he kind of thumbed through it, look apparently that I knew what I was doing. He's like, "Well, yeah, go on our website, check out the grounds for submitting things, the guidelines, and if that's all good to you, send it in. We'll review it." And I did, and they accepted it. And it was like a hybrid publishing model where we had to put up like 80% of the money to get it published. But that way too, he knows we got blood in the game, and I'm going to be out hustling and selling on my own, because it's not, can't just sit back and let, Google or Amazon, whoever sell books that way for you, because you're going to be waiting a long time. So I've had fun going out and doing that too, lining up events with libraries and bookstores and hearing some really, really cool stories too. I think that's my favorite part. My favorite story I've heard so far was a guy whose great uncle was in Chicago in like the 1920s. And he was a kid, 10, 12 years old, walking down the sidewalk. And there was this bag sitting in front of this guy's house, and he kicked it and it exploded. And it turned out that house belonged to the Chicago mayor. So it was like an anarchist attempt to take out the mayor or whatever. But this kid wound up being blinded in one eye. And so he's in the hospital in Chicago, and the Yankees happened to be playing in town at that time. They found out about it. He went and visited that kid, signed a baseball for him and everything. And of course, it was in the family for a while. Then somebody sold it, and that's gone. But that story remains, and it's just incredible to hear stories like that. In fact, my publisher too, he's got an autographed Babe Ruth baseball. He's only shown me pictures. I want to see it in person someday. But his grandfather was on the University of Iowa baseball team, I think as a coach or whatever. But this ball was signed by Ruth and by the guy who was the head coach for the Iowa Hawkeye baseball team at the time. And so Tony's got that in his office. I'm like,
that's neat.
Oh, yeah.
It's the, is, even though like Babe's been dead, we'll 80 plus years, right? He, is it right? I think it's close to 80 years. He's still very alive. I mean, we talk about him all the time. I mean, there's all kinds of words I'd never say, but I say Babe Ruth quite frequently without even trying, and it's incredible when you think about there's people that maybe there's nobody left that has a living memory of it. We're getting to that point in time where maybe the last couple people, are around for that, but still, their kids are around, and these guys really are in so many ways still alive, and they talk about certain memories and everything. Wade Hoyt passes in the 80s, but he had all of these people, in his whole life, and all these coaches that have these lives in baseball that are 60 and 50 years long. It's amazing how contained that history is.
Yeah. And it's and have you been to the Negro League Hall of Fame yet?
I sure have.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Bob on the show oh my God, it's great. Yeah. And Bob Kendrick is great. And so anytime I get to talk to him or try to visit, I definitely try to, because it's just remarkable.
I've been down there like 3 times, and I'm just amazed every time you walk in, and all the stories that are there, and you just think of how baseball history would have been different if those guys could have been allowed to play. You got somebody like Landis keeping them all out of baseball forever. I was just listening to something today, and John McGraw, I think, he was an asshole, but he wanted to get black players signed. Babe Ruth was, he loved playing against anybody. He had no problems at all playing against black players. And
right.
I think that's why the black community really respected him too. And the whole underclass, because he was like the American dream. It's like he came from terrible, terrible conditions in Baltimore. It was bad. They were, they lived next to a little creek, and there was a meat packing place up the road that was dumping all their pig shit into it.
Yeah.
Kind of like Iowa these days, but we won't go there. So that's why I think he was really embraced by the people that, hey, if somebody like that can do it, then I can do it. And he never forgot where he came from either. That's why he really looked out for little kids, especially, and, visiting veterans' homes and things like that. Before he played in Des Moines one time, he went to the VA hospital in Knoxville and visited with a lot of the veterans down there that were all messed up, so.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking at a paper here, the Tulsa Tribune, because we were, getting about to talk about their time in Drumright, but there's an article in there, right? This is October 26th, so a little later in the month, but it's Ruth's mode of living will cut careers short, and it's a pretty heavy, like, hey, this guy's screws around too much, and he's not going to make it. It's 1922, and so. Even when we think about this iconic guy, there was a considerable amount of dissent, especially after his performance in 22 and the team fell apart. Obviously, he does better and does great for the next 10 years or so, but it is funny to see these other things because we never think about the critique of Babe, in terms of a sports writer's point of view. And by the way, no byline in this story. So
right.
Yeah. Right, and maybe it's discernible in some other paper where it's written, but I think this is a local thing, and someone takes a crack at Babe, and I would love to read that story. That guy 5 years later talking about Babe, is he still as hard on him, or he's like, yeah, never mind what I said. This guy's great, because we didn't know great Babe yet. He'd been Titanic, but he hadn't done it.
Right, yeah. That's what's interesting too. Is like, okay, if these people 10 years later would have known how Babe would have turned out, would they have shown up for the games, and some of those deals too, where it's like, okay, people didn't show up to see him play at this city. It's like, well, I tried to put modern life into that perspective too. It's like, all right, you got a job, you might have to be working that night. Maybe your babysitter fell through. Maybe you don't have any money. There was, the farmers, the Midwest had a great run till about 1920 after the war ended. And then the Depression started for farmers, like right at the end of World War I, because they weren't selling all these commodities to help go over toward the war and things like that too. So,
yeah. And you can see that when you look at the paper and the commodity prices are on the first page. Like this was important to him. I was thinking about Laura Ingalls Wilder because she gets in I think it's her or her friends, probably a Model A, and they drive across the nation. These are ladies, and there's not always a road, and so these cars are off-roading, and they're so torquey because of the way they were built. Not that big of a deal, but you don't think about a mom, her daughter, and another lady driving from Missouri to San Francisco in a car that can't do 50 miles an hour. And sometimes they got to drive through gullies and ravines.
Well, and tires back then too were crap because there was, in my book, I think somebody had like 3 blowouts go into the game. And they didn't get there till like the 6th inning, and it's like they had to turn around and drive 70 miles home in the dark with crappy wheels, still crappy tires. So we don't think about that.
The quality of everything in that car and how it ran, it needed constant attention. And so, you could actually have a small gas station with mechanic shop and make a good living because the cars broke down all the time. It's not now like, with the cars going 200,000 miles, no problem.
Right.
Yeah. Did you find anything interesting in terms of the well-being of these guys? Because again, no antibiotics. The diet is at least questionable, if not horrible, when it comes to what they're eating day in, day out. What did you find that was shocking about that?
Nothing, I guess, off the top of my head. Just
okay,
maybe just thinking about the fact that there was no, they didn't really have the trainers or anything like that advising them to, hey, maybe you want to be exercising during the off season. Some of these guys would show up for spring training and hadn't lifted a weight or thrown a ball for 3 or 4 months,
right.
That Babe pretty much ate and drank whatever he wanted. You love those stories where he ate a dozen hot dogs and a case of beer, then went up to play baseball or whatever,
Yeah. How many kids did him and Bob have that month? I mean, oh my God. Because these guys weren't careful. There's no way they were careful,
How many did they have, you think?
Yeah, I wonder how many kids were born. I mean, they may not have known about them, but I mean,
okay,
around like that.
So, that Jane Levy book I was telling you about, look her up. She wrote one about Sandy Koufax, and she wrote one about Mickey Mantle too. I haven't read the Mantle one. The Koufax one is amazing. Yeah, Jane Levy, spelled like heavy, only with an L. But she said that she speculates that maybe Babe was sterile because he only had one daughter that was verifiably his. There were a couple other women that tried to, take him to court over stuff, but nothing ever became of that. And you would think that if he wasn't sterile, as much screwing around as he did, there'd be 20 little Babe Ruths running around out there. And the girl that he did father was actually from a mistress, and him and his wife adopted that little girl and kind of raised her as their own. But so even that part of it is scandalous,
Yeah. Do you got another book in you?
I want next to do if I was going to do another baseball book, I would like to do in 1946 or 47. Well, Satchel Paige did a lot of barnstorming with Dizzy Dean early on, and him and Bob Feller teamed up. And after the war, Feller put together a team of, white baseball all-stars, and Satch did the same with the black Negro League stars. And they were the first. They traveled around the country separately, separate accommodations, all that stuff. But that was the first time any sports teams traveled by air. Oh. And so I think that would be a cool book. There were a lot of big time all-stars that played. Remember Gil Hodges was playing for Feller's team, and some of the, Satch had a bunch of guys. So that would be cool. The other, what I would really like to do is my mom is still alive, and she's got and I've inherited a lot of genealogical stuff on both my mom and dad's side. Yeah. There's some cool stories there that I want to do, like for grandpas that were in the Civil War. I just wrote something on my blog, which is Barnstorming Brain, a Substack column, about my grandma's brother that rode with John Brown, a guy named Charles Tidd. And I got some Salem witch grandmas, just stuff like that.
Stuff like that.
Which I think is pretty cool.
For your Substack in here. Check out Tim's Substack right here. You guys know how to do this, but Barnstorming Brain, it came right up when I searched it. Put it right here. You can see that right there. Nice and easy.
Thank you.
And then, of course, let's plug Tim's book one more time. Barnstorming Babe. I love it. It was great. If you like baseball history, if someone in your life likes baseball history, this is a great book for them. Everybody loves Babe stories. By the way, you know what I always say? Buy two. Buddy, read it. I'm serious about this. Buddy, read it. If you want to talk to me about it, we'll get on the phone and talk about it. Here's another good one, too. We're not plugging this book, but we're just talking about it. The Season of Shattered Dreams. It was written by Eric Vickery. Have you seen this book?
I have not.
You're going to love it. You're going to love it. It's about a baseball team. Yeah. And Eric does a great. He's like one of the guys that writes a lot of the bios on the Saber site. But he found this story that a lot of folks in Washington know, but the rest of us don't know. And it's a team bus that goes basically off a cliff. And and it's right after World War II. So you got all these great stories of, like, here's a kid who was young, here's a kid whose career got stalled by the war, and they're all about to go somewhere. And they're all about to have that reckoning of, you're high enough up in baseball now that if you still got it, or if you're coming up and you got it, you're going to go to a big spot. And then the shattered dream thing comes along, and it's crazy. And some of these guys coached and stayed in baseball for years afterward. But it's such a good book. You'll love it. So that's why I bring it up, even though we're trying to promote your book. I'm like, you got to read this book. It's so good. Anything else you want to say before we wrap this up? Anything you want to ask me? Anything else at all?
Oh, this has just been a real blast being on your show. I've seen the roster of some of the people you've had, and I'm probably the most insignificant guest you'll ever have. But I'm just honored. I'm really pleased to be on here. Had a great time with you.
Good.
And appreciate it. If you want to order the book directly from me, I can sign it for you. TimGroverBooks.com. So
put that link
make it
in
easy there.
TimGroverBooks.com.
Yeah, and I'm not the same Tim Grover who's the athletic trainer for Michael Jordan. My sports career ended with the intramural softball in a junior college. So there you go.
I'm going to put this in the thing here so you guys can see it. And so TimGroverBooks.com. This Tim Grover, not that one. The other one's great. Maybe we'll get the other Tim Grover on. Yeah, and you guys can. There can be only one, and you guys can do a fight or something.
Yeah, he's a little bit more. He's a bit more intense than I am.
He's in shape.
Put it that way. Yeah.
Well, this is great. Let me turn this thing off. Everybody else, I will see you on next week. Got a couple things lined up. A little bit like I'm doing some surgery stuff, but we'll come back to you. And don't worry, I'm always working, so there'll be shows coming up. And Tim, thank you very much. I'll see you in a second. Say goodbye properly. Here we go.
Thank you.